Hey guys, and welcome back. Tonight we step onto a harbor at the very edge of the world we think we know. A place where the salt air carries something far worse than the smell of fish and tar. Imagine standing on a stone quay in the autumn of 1347, watching ships drift towards you out of the morning haze. They are familiar ships. You have seen 1,000 like them. But these move strangely. Their sails hang slack. No one calls out from the deck. No one waves. And as they bump against the dock, you begin to understand that whatever is aboard those vessels is not coming to trade. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see? How do you outrun something that travels faster than any horse, slips through locked doors, and kills the strong as easily as the weak? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, what do you do when the people you trust most, the priest, the physician, the mother who raised you, have no more protection than you do? So before we drift any deeper into the dark, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the kind of history I tell here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you right now. I always find it fascinating to see who's gathered here in the quiet, scattered across the world, all listening to the same story at once. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Settle in, pull something warm over yourself, and let the outside world fade for a while. Because tonight we are traveling to a moment when the outside world fell apart entirely. We begin at sea. The Mediterranean in October has a particular kind of light. The summer heat has broken, the storms of winter have not yet arrived, and for a few golden weeks, the water turns calm and the sky stretches pale and enormous over the trading routes that have connected continents for centuries. Merchants love this season. It is when the last great voyages of the year come home, holds heavy with silk, spices, grain, and silver. It is a season of profit, of reunion, of ships returning safely to harbor before the dangerous months. In the autumn of 1347, a fleet of Genoese trading galleys made their way west across this calm sea, bound for the busy ports of Sicily and Italy. They had come a long way. Their journey had begun far to the east, in the bustling trading colonies that Italian merchants had established along the shores of the Black Sea, where the goods of Asia flowed into European hands. These were experienced sailors on a well-traveled road. Nothing about the route was unusual. Nothing about the cargo seemed remarkable, and yet these ships would become some of the most infamous vessels in human history, because something had come aboard with them, something they did not declare, did not understand, and could not have stopped. The first hint that these were no ordinary ships came as they approached land. Sailors on the docks of Messina, on the northeastern tip of Sicily, would have seen the galleys arriving and felt, at first, only the ordinary anticipation of trade. But as the ships drew closer, the wrongness became impossible to ignore. The crews were too few. The men who remained moved slowly, sickly, leaning against rails and rigging, and those who came close enough to see the sailors' faces recoiled from what they found there. According to the accounts that survive, the men aboard were dying. Strange swellings had risen on their bodies, in the armpits, in the groin, in the neck. Some were the size of an egg, others the size of an apple. The swellings oozed and stank. The sick burned with fever, vomited blood, and raved in delirium. Dark blotches spread beneath their skin, as though the body itself were rotting while still alive. And those who developed these signs were almost always dead within days, sometimes within hours. The people of Messina did what frightened people often do. They drove the ships away, ordering the fleet out of the harbor. But it was already far too late. The thing the galleys carried did not need the sailors to walk it ashore. It had already slipped onto the docks, into the warehouses, into the narrow streets of the port town. And from there it began to spread with a speed that would terrify everyone who witnessed it. To understand what had arrived, we have to understand what no one in 1347 could possibly have known. The disease we now call the Black Death was almost certainly caused by a bacterium, a microscopic organism that modern scientists identify as Yersinia pestis. It lived in the bloodstreams of small mammals and traveled in the bodies of fleas. When an infected flea bit a human being, it could pass the bacterium into the blood, where it multiplied and overwhelmed the body's defenses. The swellings the sailors suffered, called buboes, gave the most common form of the disease its name, bubonic plague. But here is where the picture grows more complicated and where historians and scientists still debate the details to this day. The plague seems to have struck in more than one form. The bubonic form, spread by flea bites, was horrifying enough. But there appears also to have been a pneumonic form, which settled in the lungs and could pass directly from person to person through the air through a single cough or breath. This form killed even faster and spread even more easily. Some researchers argue that the speed and scale of the catastrophe cannot be explained by fleas alone, and that the pneumonic form must have played a major role. Others point to additional factors, to climate, to malnutrition, to the dense and filthy conditions of medieval towns. The exact mechanics remain a subject of serious study and disagreement. What is not in doubt is the result. Within months, the disease had leapt from Sicily to the Italian mainland, to the great trading cities of Genoa and Venice and Pisa. From there it spread outward along every road and river and sea lane that medieval commerce had built. The very networks that had made Europe rich, the routes that carried grain and cloth and coin between distant cities, now carried death with the same efficiency. Trade had connected the continent, and connection, in this autumn and the years that followed, became a curse. The people who watched it happen had no framework to understand it. They knew nothing of bacteria, nothing of microscopic life, nothing of the fleas that carried doom in their bellies. They reached instead for the explanations their world provided. Some believed it was a punishment from God, a divine judgment for the sins of humanity. Some blamed corrupted air, a poisonous mist they called miasma, rising from swamps or carried on ill winds. Some looked to the heavens and blamed a particular alignment of the planets, which learned physicians of the time genuinely cited as a cause. And some, in the darkest turn of the catastrophe, blamed their neighbors. A development we will return to because it produced some of the most shameful violence of the entire era. But in that first autumn, in Messina and the ports beyond, there was mostly only confusion and terror. People had seen plagues before. Disease was a constant companion in the medieval world, but they had never seen anything like this. Never something that killed so many, so fast, so indiscriminately. The old, the young, the rich, the poor, the pious and the wicked alike. The disease did not care, and that indifference, more than anything, broke something in the medieval mind. Settle deeper now. Because to truly understand the night the Black Death arrived, we have to step back from the harbor and look at the world it was about to consume. We have to understand what Europe was before the dying began. The Europe of the early 14th century was a world that believed, in many ways, that it had already endured the worst. It had not. But it had reasons for its grim confidence. This was a continent of perhaps 70 to 80 million people, though historians still debate the precise figure, because medieval record-keeping was inconsistent and incomplete. Most of these people were peasants, working the land much as their ancestors had for centuries, bound by obligation to lords whose own power rested on the labor of those beneath them. The vast majority lived and died within a few miles of where they were born, their entire world contained in a single village, a single church, a single set of fields turning slowly through the seasons. It was a world that had, in the centuries before, actually been growing. The population had expanded. New land had been cleared for farming. Towns had swelled into cities. Trade had flourished, connecting the wool of England to the looms of Flanders, the spices of the East to the markets of Italy. There was a sense, among those who thought about such things, of a world becoming larger, richer, more connected. But the early decades of the 1300s had already begun to test that optimism. The climate itself seemed to be shifting. After centuries of relatively warm and stable weather that had supported the population boom, the temperatures began to cool, the rains grew heavier, and the harvests began to fail. Between 1315 and 1317, a catastrophic series of wet summers ruined crops across much of northern Europe, producing a famine so severe that it killed perhaps millions. People ate their seed grain, then their animals, then, in the worst accounts, things far more desperate. The Great Famine, as it became known, was a warning that the medieval world existed on a knife's edge, that its growing population had pushed against the very limits of what the land could provide. This matters enormously for understanding what came next, because a population weakened by decades of hunger, crowded into filthy towns, living on poor diets in close contact with their animals, was a population dangerously vulnerable to disease. Historians generally agree that the conditions of early 14th century Europe created a kind of tinder, dry, and waiting. The plague was the spark. Though scholars continue to debate exactly how much these prior weaknesses amplified the death toll, the broad picture is clear enough. Europe was not a healthy, thriving world struck down at its peak. It was a strained and fragile one, already trembling when the ships arrived. The medieval town, in particular, was a place that modern people would find almost unimaginably unsanitary. Waste of every kind ran in the streets. Refuse piled in corners. Water came from wells and rivers that were routinely contaminated. People lived packed together in wooden houses, often sharing space with livestock. And crucially, they lived among rats. The black rat, in particular, thrived in these conditions, nesting in the thatch of roofs and the timbers of warehouses, traveling aboard ships in the cargo holds. And where there were rats, there were fleas. The very fabric of medieval urban life was a perfect highway for the disease. There was no understanding of any of this. Medieval medicine, inherited from ancient Greek and Roman texts and filtered through centuries of religious interpretation, operated on theories that bore no relationship to the actual causes of disease. The dominant idea was that the body was governed by four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that illness arose when these fell out of balance. Treatment aimed to restore that balance through bloodletting, through purging, through carefully chosen foods and herbs. None of it could touch a bacterial infection coursing through the blood. A physician of 1347 was, against the plague, almost entirely helpless, though few of them would have admitted it. And yet these physicians were not fools. They were often deeply learned men, educated in the great universities of Bologna, Paris, Montpellier. They wrote careful treatises observing the disease, recording its symptoms and its course with genuine precision. What they lacked was not intelligence, but a framework. They were trying to understand an invisible enemy with tools designed for an entirely different war. We should be cautious about mocking them. In their position, with their knowledge, most of us would have done no better. Religion, meanwhile, sat at the absolute center of the medieval understanding of the world. The church was not merely a spiritual institution, it was the framework through which nearly everyone interpreted existence itself. Disease, suffering, death, all of it was understood within a divine plan. If a plague came, it came for a reason. God was either punishing sin or testing faith. And this belief, while it offered comfort to some, would also shape the catastrophe in profound and sometimes terrible ways. When prayer failed to stop the dying, when the priests themselves fell sick and died, the resulting crisis of faith would shake the medieval worldview to its foundations. This was the world, then, that the galleys sailed into. A world densely populated yet fragile, connected yet defenseless, deeply faithful yet about to have that faith tested beyond anything in living memory. A world that believed it understood the shape of suffering and was about to discover that it understood nothing at all. The stage was set. The ships had come, and the dying was about to begin in earnest. To understand how the disease reached those Genoese galleys in the first place, we have to follow the trade routes backward, east across the Black Sea, to a city that has become legendary in the story of the plague. A city called Kaffa. Kaffa was a trading colony, a port on the Crimean Peninsula controlled by merchants from Genoa. It was one of the great hinges of medieval commerce, a place where the goods of Asia, carried overland across the vast steppes and along the routes we now call the Silk Road, were loaded onto ships for the journey to European markets. It was a wealthy, cosmopolitan place, a meeting point of cultures and languages and faiths. And in the years before the plague reached Europe, it became the setting for one of the most chilling episodes in the entire history of the disease. By the 1340s, the plague had already been moving westward across Asia for years, perhaps even decades. Its precise origin remains a matter of scholarly debate. Many researchers have pointed to the region of Central Asia, where the bacterium may have circulated in populations of wild rodents for a very long time before some change. In climate, in human movement, in the rodent populations themselves, sent it spilling outward into human society. Recent studies of ancient DNA and of burial sites have offered tantalizing clues, but the full story of where and how the pandemic began is still being pieced together. What we can say is that by the time it reached Kaffa, it had already carved a path of death across enormous distances. In 1346, Kaffa came under siege. The city was attacked by the forces of the Golden Horde, the Mongol-descended power that dominated the steppes to the north and east. The Genoese defenders held out behind their walls, and the siege dragged on. But then the besieging army itself was struck by the plague. The disease tore through their camp, killing soldiers by the thousands. And here we come to one of the most famous and most debated stories of the medieval world. According to an account written by a notary named Gabriele de Mussi, the besieging forces, ravaged by the plague and unable to take the city by force, resorted to a horrifying tactic. They loaded the bodies of their own plague dead onto their siege engines and hurled them over the walls into the city, hoping to spread the disease among the defenders. If true, this would be one of the earliest recorded acts of biological warfare in human history. Now, we must be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of story where the evidence grows thin and the debate among historians grows sharp. De Mussi was not himself present at the siege. He was writing later, based on reports that reached him. Some historians accept the account as broadly accurate. Others are deeply skeptical, pointing out that the disease could easily have spread into the city through the ordinary movement of rats and fleas without any need for catapulted corpses. The dramatic image of bodies flying over the walls may be true, or it may be an embellishment, a way of making sense of a horror that defied explanation. What survives in the record suggests a real catastrophe at Kaffa, but the precise mechanism remains uncertain. What seems clear is that, however the disease got into the city, it did get in. And when the Genoese merchants finally fled Kaffa, taking to their ships to escape both the siege and the sickness, they carried the plague with them. Their vessels became the carriers that would bring the disease across the sea to the Mediterranean ports of Europe. The galleys that arrived at Messina in 1347 were, in a sense, the final leg of a journey that had begun thousands of miles to the east and had already left countless dead in its wake. There is something haunting in this image. The ships fleeing one catastrophe only to deliver another. The merchants of Kaffa believed they were escaping death. They were, in fact, becoming its messengers. They could not have known. The disease incubated silently, showing no signs for days, so that a man could board a ship feeling perfectly well and carry doom in his blood across an entire sea. By the time the symptoms appeared, the damage was done. The plague had already established itself in a new harbor, a new town, a new population with no defenses and no warning. This is one of the cruelest features of the entire pandemic, and one that made it so impossible to contain. The disease moved faster than knowledge of it. A town might hear rumors of a sickness in a distant city, might even take precautions, might turn away suspicious ships as Messina tried to do. But the plague was already aboard the ships that had come before, already nesting in the warehouses, already biding its time in the bodies of those who felt no symptoms yet. By the time the dying started, containment was impossible. The enemy was already inside the walls, and so from Kaffa to Messina, from Messina to the mainland, from the mainland outward along every artery of trade and travel, the Black Death began its conquest of Europe. It would take only a few short years to spread across nearly the entire continent, and in those years, it would kill on a scale that the world had never seen and would not see again for centuries. The numbers are almost impossible to grasp. Historians estimate that the Black Death killed somewhere between a third and a half of the entire population of Europe, though here again the figures are debated and vary enormously by region. Some areas may have lost as much as 60% of their people, others somewhat less. But across the continent as a whole, the death toll was so vast that it defies comprehension. Tens of millions dead in the space of a few years, whole villages emptied, cities transformed into charnel houses, a civilization brought, in some places, to the very edge of collapse. But statistics, however staggering, cannot convey what it was actually like to live through it. To understand that, we have to leave the ships and the trade routes behind and step into the streets of a town as the dying begins. Imagine now that you live in one of those Italian cities in the winter of 1347 and the spring of 1348. You have heard the rumors. Travelers and merchants have brought word of a terrible sickness in the south, in Sicily, spreading north. Perhaps you did not believe them. Rumors of distant disasters are common and most never touch your own life. But then the sickness arrives in your own city, and everything you thought you understood about the world begins to come apart. It often starts quietly. A neighbor falls ill. At first it seems like nothing unusual. A fever, a headache, a sense of exhaustion. People fall sick all the time, but then the swellings appear. The buboes, rising in the neck, the armpit, the groin, hot and hard and agonizing. The fever climbs. The sick person grows delirious, raving, unable to recognize their own family. Dark patches spread across the skin, and within a few days, sometimes within a single day, your neighbor is dead. Then another falls sick, and another. And you begin to realize, with mounting horror, that this is not an ordinary illness. This is something that moves through your street, your neighborhood, your city like a fire through dry grass. The bodies begin to accumulate faster than they can be buried. The church bells, which once tolled for each individual death, fall silent, because there are simply too many dead to mark each one. The normal rituals of death, the careful mourning, the proper funerals, the burial in consecrated ground with prayers and ceremony, all of it collapses under the sheer weight of the dying. The contemporary accounts of this period are among the most harrowing documents in all of human history. One of the most famous comes from the Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague in the city of Florence and described it in the introduction to his collection of stories, the Decameron. We must read such accounts with some care, because writers of the time often shaped their descriptions for dramatic or moral effect, and the line between observation and literary embellishment is not always clear. But the broad picture that emerges from Boccaccio and from many other witnesses is consistent and terrible. People died in the streets, Boccaccio wrote, and their bodies were not discovered until the stench reached their neighbors. The sick were abandoned, even by those who loved them most. He described, in one particularly devastating observation, how the catastrophe broke the most fundamental human bonds. How brothers abandoned brothers, how parents refused to tend their own children, how the terror of contagion overcame even the deepest instincts of love and family. Whether every detail is literally accurate or somewhat heightened, the underlying truth is hard to dismiss. The plague did not only kill bodies, it attacked the very fabric of human society, the bonds of care and obligation that hold a community together. Consider what this meant in practical, human terms. In a normal death, even a tragic one, there is a structure that holds. The dying person is tended. The family gathers. The priest comes to administer the last rites, the final sacrament that medieval Christians believed was essential for the soul's salvation. The body is washed, prepared, mourned, buried with ceremony. The community absorbs the loss and continues. But the plague shattered all of this. People died alone because no one dared come near them. Bodies lay unburied because there was no one to bury them, or because the grave diggers themselves had died. And perhaps most agonizing of all for the medieval mind, people died without the last rites, without confession, without the spiritual preparation they believed their eternal souls required. To die unconfessed and unanointed was, in the medieval understanding, to risk damnation. The plague did not only threaten people's lives, it threatened, in their own minds, their immortal souls. The disposal of the dead became one of the most desperate problems of the entire catastrophe. In the early days, efforts were made to bury the dead properly in individual graves in churchyards. But the churchyards filled. There was no more room. And so cities began to dig great pits, enormous communal graves into which the dead were thrown by the dozens, by the hundreds. Boccaccio described bodies layered in these pits like goods in a ship's hold, covered with a little earth, then another layer of bodies, then more earth, again and again. The careful individuality of medieval death, each person commended to God by name, dissolved into anonymous mass burial. Recent archaeological excavations of plague pits in various European cities have confirmed the broad accuracy of these accounts, revealing the remains of many individuals buried together in haste, though the excavations also show that even in extremity, some care was often taken to lay bodies out with a degree of order and respect. Even at the edge of collapse, the human impulse toward dignity did not entirely vanish. The economic and social effects were immediate and chaotic. As people died, the ordinary functioning of the city ground to a halt. Shops closed, markets emptied, the supply of food and goods grew uncertain. Those who could afford to flee did so, abandoning the cities for the countryside in the hope of escaping the contagion. The wealthy, in particular, often retreated to country estates, leaving the poor trapped in the dying towns. But flight offered no guarantee of safety. The plague spread to the countryside as well, carried by the very refugees who hoped to escape it, and there too it killed without mercy. For those who remained, daily life became a kind of waking nightmare. To walk through the streets was to pass the dead and the dying. To enter a house was to risk finding a family destroyed. The air itself, people believed, was poisoned, and they tried to protect themselves with whatever they could, covering their faces, burning aromatic herbs and woods in the belief that sweet smells could ward off the corrupted air, carrying flowers and spices to hold against their noses. None of it worked, of course, because the disease did not travel as they imagined. But the gestures reveal a population grasping desperately for any measure of control, any way to feel less utterly helpless before a force they could neither see nor understand. And underneath it all ran a current of profound psychological devastation. Imagine the experience of watching your entire world die around you, of burying your children, your parents, your friends, your neighbors, one after another, with no end in sight, no explanation that made sense, no protection you could rely on. Imagine the terror of each new morning, wondering whether today the swelling would appear on your own body. Imagine the strange and terrible guilt of survival, of living while everyone around you died. The plague inflicted wounds that went far beyond the physical. It traumatized an entire civilization, leaving marks on the European mind that would persist for generations. Some responded to this trauma with a kind of frantic hedonism. If death could come at any moment, if all the careful structures of life could collapse in a matter of days, then why not seize whatever pleasure remained? Boccaccio and other writers described people throwing themselves into drinking, feasting, and revelry, abandoning the restraints of normal behavior in the face of imminent death. Others responded with the opposite impulse, withdrawing into isolation and extreme religious devotion, hoping that piety might save them where everything else had failed. And some, as we will see, responded with a dark and violent search for someone to blame. But before we follow those darker paths, we must sit for a moment with the simple, overwhelming human scale of the loss. Behind every statistic, every estimate of a third or a half of the population dead, lies an individual human being, a person who woke each morning, who loved and feared and hoped, who had a name and a family and a place in the world. The Black Death did not kill an abstraction. It killed people, one by the millions. Each death was a world ending, and the medieval mind, for all its faith and all its learning, had no way to absorb a catastrophe of such dimensions. It could only endure it, day by terrible day, and try somehow to survive. When the plague came, people did what people have always done in the face of suffering. They sent for the doctor, and the doctors came. They came in their robes and their learning, carrying centuries of accumulated medical wisdom, ready to do battle with the disease. What none of them yet understood was that they had brought knives to a war they could not even see. Medieval medicine was not, as it is sometimes imagined, a chaos of superstition and guesswork. It was a sophisticated intellectual tradition, built on the foundations laid down by the great physicians of the ancient world. Above all, Hippocrates and Galen, whose writings had been preserved, translated, expanded, and debated for over 1,000 years. A learned physician of 1348 had studied for years at a university. He could quote the authorities. He could reason about the body with great subtlety. He was, by the standards of his time, a deeply educated man. The tragedy was that the entire edifice of his knowledge rested on a foundation that was simply wrong. The central idea, as we touched on earlier, was the theory of the four humours. The body, in this understanding, contained four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, each associated with particular qualities of heat and cold, moisture and dryness. Health was a state of balance among these humours. Disease was an imbalance, and the physician's task was to restore the balance, either by removing what was in excess or by adding what was lacking. It was an elegant system, internally consistent, capable of explaining almost anything. And against an infectious bacterial disease, it was utterly useless. Consider the most common treatment of the age: bloodletting. If the body held too much blood, or if the blood had become corrupted, then the obvious remedy was to remove some of it. The physician would open a vein, or apply leeches, or cut the patient and let the blood flow into a basin. For a vast range of ailments, this was the standard prescription. Against the plague, it was not merely useless, but actively harmful, weakening already failing bodies, draining strength from patients who needed every reserve they had. We can only imagine how many of the sick were pushed closer to death by the very treatment meant to save them. Yet we should resist the easy temptation to mock. The physicians were following the best science they knew, applying it diligently, often at great personal risk to themselves. Many of them caught the plague tending their patients and died alongside them. The physicians also reached for other explanations. The most influential learned theory held that the disease arose from corrupted air. The miasma we mentioned before. The air itself, people believed, had become poisoned, perhaps by rotting matter, perhaps by foul vapors rising from the earth, perhaps by some great cosmic disturbance. In 1348, the medical faculty of the University of Paris, asked by the King of France to explain the catastrophe, produced a famous report. They concluded that the plague had been caused, in part, by a particular conjunction of the planets Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars that had occurred some years earlier, which had corrupted the air and set the disaster in motion. To modern ears, this sounds absurd, but it was the considered judgment of the finest medical minds in Europe, reasoning carefully from the principles they held to be true. They were not stupid. They were working with a map of the world that did not match the territory. If the air was poisoned, then the logical defense was to purify or avoid it. And so people burned aromatic woods and herbs, filling their homes with smoke in the belief that strong, sweet smells could drive out the corruption. They carried pomanders, small balls of fragrant material, to hold against their faces. They lit fires in the streets. Some physicians advised fleeing to higher ground where the air was thought to be cleaner, or avoiding the foul vapors of swamps and stagnant water. Curiously, some of this advice may have accidentally helped, not for the reasons imagined, but because fleeing crowded, rat-infested towns for the open countryside might genuinely have reduced exposure to the disease. The right action for entirely the wrong reason. The medieval world stumbled, now and then, towards something useful without ever understanding why. And then there is the image that, more than any other, has become the symbol of the plague itself. The plague doctor in his long waxed coat and his terrible beaked mask. This figure has burned itself into the modern imagination, appearing in films, costumes, and nightmares. But here we must be careful, because the popular image and the historical reality do not entirely align, and historians have worked to untangle the two. The famous beaked mask, with its long, curved, bird-like nose, was a real piece of protective equipment. But it appears to have been developed considerably later than the Black Death of 1347 to 1351, more commonly associated with the outbreaks of the 17th century, some 300 years afterward. The design is usually credited to a French physician of the 1600s. The beak was packed with aromatic herbs, dried flowers, and spices. Once again, the logic of fighting corrupted air with sweet smells. The doctor would breathe through this filter of fragrance, believing it protected him from the miasma. The long coat, often treated with wax, the gloves, the wide-brimmed hat. The staff used to examine patients without touching them. All of it formed a kind of early protective suit, designed against an enemy the wearer fundamentally misunderstood. So when you picture the Black Death of the 14th century, the beaked mask is, strictly speaking, an anachronism. The physicians who faced the first great wave looked much like ordinary learned men of their day. But the mask has become so bound up with the idea of plague that it is now nearly impossible to separate them, and perhaps there is a kind of poetry in that. A symbol that captures the horror even if it gets the date wrong. What did it actually feel like to be a physician in those years? Imagine the position. You have devoted your life to the study of medicine. You have been trained to heal, to ease suffering, to push back against death. And now you face a disease that ignores everything you know. Your treatments do nothing. Your patients die no matter what you do. You watch the swellings rise, the fever climb, the dark patches spread, and you have nothing that can stop it. And all the while, you know that simply by entering the sick room, you are risking your own life. Some physicians fled, abandoning their patients and their cities, and they were bitterly condemned for it. Others stayed, and many of them died. There is a quiet heroism in those who remained, doing what little they could, offering comfort where they could not offer cure, dying at their posts in a war they had no hope of winning. There were, scattered through the catastrophe, glimmers of something more practical. Some cities, observing that the disease seemed to spread from the sick to the well and from town to town, began to take measures that we would now recognize as the beginnings of public health. They tried to isolate the sick. They restricted the movement of people and goods. And in one of the most significant developments, certain port cities began to hold arriving ships at a distance for a period of time before allowing anyone to disembark to see whether sickness would appear among those aboard. In the city of Ragusa, on the Adriatic coast, and later in Venice, this waiting period was set, eventually, at 40 days. The Italian word for 40, quaranta, gave us the word we still use today, quarantine. It is a small, strange legacy of the catastrophe that one of our most basic public health concepts was born from the desperate, half-blind efforts of medieval cities to hold back an enemy they could not understand. They did not know what they were fighting, but through painful observation, they began, dimly, to grasp how it moved. And that knowledge, however incomplete, would outlast the plague itself. But for all these scattered efforts, the overwhelming reality of the physician's war was defeat. The disease could not be cured, could not be reliably prevented, could not even be properly explained. And as the dying mounted and the doctors proved as helpless as everyone else, people began, inevitably, to look elsewhere for protection. If learned medicine could not save them, perhaps faith could. And so the eyes of a terrified continent turned upward, toward heaven and toward the church that claimed to speak for it. What they would find there was a crisis as profound as the plague itself. To understand what the Black Death did to the medieval mind, you have to understand just how completely religion saturated the medieval world. We touched on this earlier, but it bears returning to because it sits at the very heart of the catastrophe's deeper meaning. For the people of 14th century Europe, the church was not one institution among many. It was the framework of existence itself. It marked the hours of the day with its bells and the seasons of the year with its festivals. It presided over birth through baptism, over adulthood through confirmation, over union through marriage, and over death through the last rites. It taught that this life was merely a brief and dangerous passage toward an eternal afterlife, and that the soul's fate, heaven, hell, or the long purification of purgatory, depended on living and dying within the grace of the Church. To be cut off from the sacraments was to be cut off from salvation itself. This was not a vague or distant belief. It was as real and as urgent to a medieval Christian as the ground beneath their feet. And so, when the plague came, people turned to the Church with desperate hope. They prayed. They confessed their sins. They went on pilgrimages, traveling to holy sites in search of divine mercy. They made offerings, lit candles, begged the saints to intercede on their behalf. Above all, they sought to understand. Why was this happening? And the answer the Church provided, the answer that came most naturally to the medieval mind, was that the plague was a punishment. God, offended by the sins of humanity, had sent this scourge as judgment. The catastrophe was, in this understanding, deserved. There was a terrible logic to this, and also a terrible comfort. If the plague was punishment for sin, then it was not random, not meaningless, not beyond human influence. It could be addressed. If humanity repented, if it turned from sin and toward God, then perhaps the punishment would be lifted. This belief gave people something to do, some way to act in the face of helplessness, and it preserved the fundamental order of their universe, in which everything happened for a reason and a just God ruled over all. But the plague did not cooperate with this understanding. And here we come to the deep wound that the catastrophe inflicted on medieval faith. People prayed, and still they died. They confessed, repented, made pilgrimages, begged for mercy. And the dying continued exactly as before. The good died alongside the wicked. The devout perished beside the sinful. Children, who could hardly have accumulated the sins to deserve such punishment, died in vast numbers. The disease made no moral distinctions whatsoever, and this was almost impossible for the medieval worldview to absorb. If the plague was God's punishment for sin, why did it strike the innocent? If prayer and repentance were the remedy, why did the faithful die anyway? The catastrophe seemed to mock the very framework people were using to understand it. And then came what may have been the most devastating blow of all. The clergy died too. The priests, the monks, the nuns, the men and women who had devoted their lives to God, who stood closest to the divine, who were supposed to be the channels of grace and protection. They sickened and died like everyone else. In many places they died at even higher rates than the general population, precisely because their duties brought them into close contact with the sick and the dying. A parish priest was obligated to attend the deathbeds of his flock, to hear final confessions, to administer the last rites, and in doing so, again and again, he exposed himself to the disease. Many priests fulfilled this duty heroically, dying as a direct result of their faithfulness. Others, terrified, abandoned their posts and fled, leaving their parishioners to die without the spiritual comfort they craved. Both responses, in their different ways, shook the foundations. Consider what this meant. If the priests themselves had no protection, if the holiest people died as readily as the rest, then what did that say about the power of the Church to shield anyone from harm? The institution that claimed to mediate between humanity and God appeared, in the face of the plague, to be as helpless as everyone else. The bells still rang. The prayers were still said. But the dying never stopped. The practical consequences were severe and immediate. The deaths of so many clergy created a desperate shortage of priests. Parishes were left without anyone to perform the sacraments. The church, scrambling to fill the gaps, ordained new priests hastily, sometimes men who were poorly educated, poorly prepared, or of questionable character, simply because warm bodies were needed to keep the institution functioning. Standards collapsed under the sheer weight of the crisis. And this, some historians argue, contributed to a longer-term decline in the prestige and authority of the clergy. The church survived the Black Death. It remained the dominant institution of European life for centuries afterward, but something had changed. A crack had opened. The unquestioning confidence in the church's power to protect and to explain had been shaken, and it would never be quite so absolute again. Some scholars trace a line, however indirect, from the spiritual upheaval of the plague years toward the great religious challenges that would shake the church in the centuries to come, though this connection is debated and surely involves many other factors as well. There was also, in some places, a turn toward a darker and more personal kind of religion. If the official structures of the church could not save you, perhaps a more intense, more direct, more extreme form of devotion could. People sought out new objects of veneration, new saints associated with protection from plague. Saint Sebastian, Saint Roch, and others whose images and relics promised intercession. Religious art of the period took on a grimmer, more death-haunted character, dwelling on mortality, judgment, and the fragility of earthly life. The famous image of the danse macabre, the dance of death, in which skeletons lead away people of every rank and station. King and peasant, pope and beggar, all equal before death, captured the spirit of the age. Death was the great leveler. It came for everyone, and no amount of wealth, power, or even piety could turn it aside. This new intensity of fear and devotion would find one of its most dramatic and disturbing expressions in a movement that swept across Europe during the plague years. A movement of men who believed that only the most extreme form of penance could appease an angry God. They marched from town to town, scourging themselves with whips, their backs torn and bloody, calling on the world to repent before it was too late. They were called the flagellants, and their story reveals just how far the terror of the plague could drive the human spirit. Imagine standing in the square of a medieval town as the dying rages all around you. The bells have fallen silent. The dead lie in the streets. And then, from down the road, you hear something approaching. A sound of voices, chanting, mournful and rhythmic. A procession comes into view. Men, dozens of them, sometimes hundreds, marching in solemn order, stripped to the waist, carrying whips. And as they march, they bring the whips down upon their own bare backs, again and again, until the flesh is torn and the blood runs freely. This is the flagellant movement. And for a few extraordinary years during the height of the plague, it became one of the most powerful and unsettling phenomena in all of Europe. The logic behind the flagellants flowed directly from the dominant understanding of the plague. If the catastrophe was God's punishment for human sin, then the remedy was penance, the act of suffering and self-denial through which a sinner sought to atone and win back divine favor. Penance was already a familiar part of medieval religious life, but the flagellants took it to an extreme that astonished even their contemporaries. They believed that ordinary repentance was not enough. The sins of humanity were so great, the anger of God so terrible, that only the most severe and public self-punishment could hope to turn the disaster aside. By scourging their own bodies, by inflicting suffering upon themselves, they sought to take on a share of the punishment, to appease God through their own pain, and to call the world to repentance before the end came. The movement was not entirely new. There had been earlier episodes of flagellant penance in the previous century, but during the plague years, particularly around 1349, it exploded across Europe with remarkable speed and intensity. Bands of flagellants formed and traveled from town to town, especially across the German lands and Central Europe. They moved in organized groups, following strict rules. They typically committed to a set period of penance, often 33.5 days, said to correspond to the years of Christ's life on earth. During this time, they were forbidden from bathing, changing their clothes, or sleeping in comfortable beds. They were to abstain from many ordinary pleasures and to dedicate themselves entirely to the work of penance. The central ritual was the public scourging. Arriving in a town, the flagellants would gather in a square or before a church, often drawing large crowds. They would strip to the waist, form a circle, and begin. They beat themselves with whips, many of which were specially made, knotted cords, sometimes set with sharp pieces of metal that tore the skin. They would fall to the ground, rise, march, and beat themselves again, all while chanting hymns and prayers. The spectacle was overwhelming. The blood, the rhythmic chanting, the raw intensity of the suffering. It moved spectators powerfully. Many wept. Some joined the movement on the spot. To a population terrified of death and desperate for some way to appease a wrathful God, the flagellants offered a vivid, visceral hope. Here were men taking action, doing something dramatic and real, suffering on behalf of a sinful world. For a time, the flagellants were widely admired. People welcomed them into their towns, fed them, treated them as holy. They seemed to embody a genuine and radical piety, a willingness to suffer for the salvation of all. In the chaos and helplessness of the plague, they offered a kind of leadership, a sense that the catastrophe could still be confronted by human action, even if that action was the tearing of one's own flesh. But the movement carried within it the seeds of serious trouble, and as it grew, it began to take a darker and more dangerous turn. This is where the flagellants reveal something important about the dynamics of mass fear and the dangers of unchecked religious fervor. As the movement spread and swelled, it began to slip beyond the control of any authority. The flagellants, claiming a special holiness through their suffering, increasingly set themselves up as rivals to the established church. Some of them began to claim spiritual powers of their own, to forgive sins, to perform miracles, to speak with divine authority. This was a direct challenge to the clergy, who alone were supposed to mediate God's grace. The flagellants, in their fervor, sometimes denounced the church as corrupt, criticized priests, and presented themselves as a purer and more authentic form of faith. A movement that had begun as an expression of extreme devotion was becoming a threat to religious order itself. And worse was to come. The intense, apocalyptic emotion that the flagellants generated could easily curdle into violence against others. As they moved through the towns, some of these bands began to direct the crowd's fear and rage toward scapegoats, and in particular, toward the Jewish communities of Europe. The same fervor that drove men to whip themselves bloody could, with terrible ease, be turned outward into hatred and murder. In some places, the arrival of the flagellants coincided with and helped to incite horrific massacres. This connection between the movement and the persecution of innocent people darkens the entire phenomenon and reminds us that mass religious emotion, however sincere, can be a profoundly dangerous force when it loses all restraint. The authorities, both religious and secular, grew increasingly alarmed. The Church, seeing its authority challenged and its order threatened, moved against the movement. In 1349, the Pope condemned the flagellants, forbidding the processions and ordering the suppression of the movement. Secular rulers in various lands also acted to disperse the bands, and gradually, under this pressure, and perhaps as the worst of the plague began to pass in some regions, the movement faded. The great processions ceased. The flagellants returned to their homes or vanished into the general population, and the extraordinary fervor of those years subsided. But the episode left its mark. The flagellant movement stands as one of the most striking examples of how the Black Death affected not just the bodies but the minds and souls of those who lived through it. It shows us a population pushed to the absolute edge of endurance, reaching for the most extreme measures imaginable in a desperate attempt to influence a catastrophe beyond their control. It shows the genuine and intense piety of the age, but also its capacity to spill over into chaos, challenge to authority, and violence against the innocent. And it raises a question that echoes through all of history. What do people do when ordinary measures fail completely? When the structures they have always relied upon collapse, when death stalks them and nothing they know can stop it? Some pray quietly. Some flee, some abandon themselves to pleasure, and some, like the flagellants, turn their fear and faith into a spectacle of blood, marching from town to town, trying to whip the world back into the favor of God. That darkest impulse, the turn toward blaming and punishing others, deserves its own full and sober reckoning. Because in the years of the Black Death, the search for someone to hold responsible led to some of the most shameful and horrifying episodes in the history of medieval Europe. To understand the full human meaning of the catastrophe, we must look directly at it, however painful it is to do so. There is a pattern in human history, repeated again and again across centuries and cultures, that emerges in times of great fear and suffering. When a catastrophe strikes that people cannot understand or control, when the ordinary explanations fail and the dying will not stop, a terrible question begins to form in the frightened mind. Not only why is this happening, but who is doing this to us? And in the search for an answer, populations have repeatedly turned upon the vulnerable among them, seeking someone to blame. The Black Death produced one of the most horrific examples of this pattern in all of history. To tell the story of the plague honestly, we cannot look away from it. As the disease spread and the death toll mounted, and as it became clear that nothing could stop it, suspicion began to grow. If the plague was God's punishment, that was one explanation. But another, darker idea took hold in some places. The idea that the plague was not natural at all, but deliberate, that someone was causing it, that the wells were being poisoned, the disease spread on purpose by enemies hidden among the population. And the people upon whom this monstrous accusation most often fell were the Jews of Europe. To understand how this happened, we have to acknowledge a grim reality of the medieval world. Anti-Semitism, hatred and persecution of Jewish people, was already deeply embedded in European society long before the plague arrived. Jewish communities lived throughout Europe, often in cities, frequently restricted in the occupations they were permitted to pursue and the places they were allowed to live. They were a minority, distinct in religion and often in custom, frequently subject to suspicion, legal discrimination, and periodic violence. This pre-existing hatred did not need the plague to exist, but the plague gave it a horrifying new outlet and a new pretext. The accusation that emerged was as baseless as it was deadly. It was claimed that Jews were deliberately spreading the plague by poisoning wells and water sources. There was, of course, not a shred of truth to this. Jewish communities suffered and died from the plague exactly as their Christian neighbors did. The disease did not spare them. But in the grip of terror and ancient prejudice, evidence and reason held little power. The accusation spread, and where it spread, violence followed. The persecutions that resulted were appalling in their scale and brutality. Across many parts of Europe, particularly in the German lands and in regions along the Rhine, Jewish communities were attacked, and in many cases, entire communities were destroyed. People were murdered in horrific numbers. In some towns, the Jewish population was burned alive, herded into buildings that were then set aflame, or killed in mass executions. Confessions were sometimes extracted through torture, and a confession obtained under torture, where a victim will say anything to make the agony stop, was then used to justify still more killing. The violence was often premeditated, organized, and carried out with the participation or at least the acquiescence of local authorities. In some cases, there were also baser motives at work beneath the religious hysteria. The desire to seize Jewish property or to escape debts owed to Jewish moneylenders. Fear, prejudice, and greed combined into something monstrous. It is important to be clear about the moral reality here, because there is no balance to strike, no other perspective that mitigates it. These were innocent people, murdered on the basis of an accusation that was completely false, in the midst of a catastrophe they were suffering and dying from themselves. The persecution was a crime of staggering proportions, one of the darkest chapters in the long and terrible history of anti-Semitic violence. And it shows, with brutal clarity, how the breakdown of a society under extreme stress can unleash the worst of human nature. how fear can be channeled into hatred and hatred into mass murder. It is also worth recording, in fairness to the historical truth, that not everyone participated in or endorsed this violence. Some voices spoke against it. The Pope himself, Clement VI, issued declarations condemning the attacks on Jews, pointing out the obvious fact that Jews were dying of the plague like everyone else and therefore could not be its cause, and ordering that they be protected. Some secular rulers and town authorities also tried to prevent the violence, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. These efforts were often overwhelmed by the fury of the mobs and the complicity of local powers, and they did not prevent the destruction of many communities, but they remind us that even in the darkest moments, there were those who saw the injustice for what it was and tried to stand against it. The capacity for cruelty and the capacity for conscience existed side by side, as they always have. The consequences of these persecutions extended far beyond the immediate horror. Many Jewish communities that had existed in Europe for generations were annihilated or driven out. Survivors fled, and patterns of Jewish settlement across Europe shifted significantly as a result, with many moving eastward to regions where they hoped to find greater safety. The geography of Jewish life in Europe was permanently altered by the violence of the plague years, a catastrophe that was, in reality, caused by a bacterium carried by fleas, became the occasion for a human-made catastrophe layered on top of it. A catastrophe of hatred, of false accusation, and of murder. Why does this matter so much for understanding the Black Death? Because it reveals something essential about how the catastrophe affected not just the body of Europe, but its soul. The plague did not only kill, it deranged. It pushed a frightened and grieving population toward its worst instincts. It demonstrated that when people cannot find a real explanation for their suffering, they will often invent one, and that the invented explanation tends to fall upon those who are already feared, already resented, already vulnerable. The search for a scapegoat is one of the oldest and most dangerous responses to disaster, and the Black Death gave it one of its most devastating expressions. There is a lesson here that reaches far beyond the 14th century, though we should be careful about drawing it too neatly. The pattern that emerged during the plague, fear curdling into suspicion, suspicion into accusation, accusation into violence against a minority, has repeated itself in many forms throughout history, down to our own times. Plagues and disasters have again and again been accompanied by the search for someone to blame, the casting of suspicion upon outsiders and minorities, the eruption of violence justified by false explanations. The Black Death is a particularly stark and terrible example, but it is not unique. And perhaps that is part of why it continues to haunt us. It shows us not only what a disease can do to human bodies, but what fear can do to human hearts. The plague did not stay in the warm ports of the Mediterranean. It could not. The same restless networks of trade and travel that had carried it from the east now carried it relentlessly northward into the heart of the continent and beyond, until there was hardly a corner of Europe it did not touch. To watch the disease spread across the map is to watch something that resembles a tide rising, slowly and then all at once, drowning region after region in the space of just a few short years. From Italy, the plague pushed in every direction. It moved west along the coast into the lands of southern France, and there it found one of the great prizes of the medieval world, the city of Avignon, which at that time was the seat of the Pope himself. The papacy had relocated from Rome to Avignon earlier in the century, and the city had become a center of wealth, power, and population. None of this offered any protection. The plague struck Avignon with terrible force, and the death toll was enormous. The Pope, Clement VI, survived, but the city around him became a place of mass death. There is a famous detail from this period, which historians treat with some caution, but which captures the atmosphere vividly. It is said that the Pope's physician advised him to sit between two large fires, even through the heat of summer, in the belief that the flames would purify the corrupted air around him. Whether or not this particular measure was truly the reason, Clement did survive the plague, and the image of the Pope of all Christendom huddled between fires while his city died around him tells us much about the helplessness of even the most powerful in the face of the disease. From France, the plague continued its march. It crossed the great mountain barrier of the Alps, which one might imagine would have slowed it. But the disease followed the mountain passes along with the merchants and travelers who used them, and it spilled down into the lands beyond. It moved into the German territories, into the Low Countries, into Switzerland, into the Iberian Peninsula to the southwest. Spain and Portugal suffered grievously. The disease seemed to find every road, every river, every trading connection, and to follow them all with grim efficiency. There was no natural barrier that could hold it, no border that could keep it out, no distance too great for it to cross given time. One of the most significant moments in the northward spread was the arrival of the plague in England. England in the 1340s was a kingdom of perhaps several million people, deeply connected by trade to the continent, particularly through the wool trade that bound English producers to the markets of Flanders and beyond. It was through these connections that the plague made its crossing. According to the traditional account, the disease arrived in England in the summer of 1348, landing at a port on the southern coast. Most often identified as Melcombe, in the area of modern Weymouth in Dorset. A ship arriving from the continent, it is said, carried the infection ashore, and from that landing point the plague began to spread through the kingdom. As with so many details of the plague's movement, the precise point and moment of arrival are debated by historians, and the disease may well have entered at more than one place. But the broad story is clear enough. By 1348, the Black Death was in England, and it would soon tear through the country as devastatingly as it had through the lands of the south. The spread within England followed the now familiar pattern. From the southern ports, the disease moved inland and along the coasts, reaching the great cities and the countless villages between them. It struck London, the largest city in the kingdom, with appalling force. The capital, crowded and filthy like all medieval cities, offered the plague an ideal environment, and the death toll there was immense. Mass graves were dug to receive the dead, great pits into which bodies were placed when the churchyards could hold no more. Archaeological excavations in modern London have uncovered some of these plague burial grounds, revealing the remains of the dead laid out, often with a surprising degree of care given the circumstances, in the soil where they had lain undisturbed for centuries. These excavations have also allowed scientists to study the actual remains of plague victims, and in some cases to recover traces of the bacterium itself from the teeth of the dead, providing direct physical confirmation of the disease that the historical records describe. It is a strange and sobering thing that across nearly 700 years, the bodies of those who died in the Great Mortality can still speak to us, can still tell us what killed them. The plague did not stop at England. It continued north into Scotland and west into Ireland and Wales, and it reached even the most remote and isolated places. One of the most haunting episodes concerns the spread of the disease to Scandinavia and the far north. According to the accounts, the plague reached Norway when a ship arrived at a port carrying a crew that was already dead or dying. The vessel drifted in, its sailors beyond help, and from that single point of contact, the disease established itself in the north and spread through Norway, Sweden, and the other Scandinavian lands. The image of the death ship drifting into harbour with its lifeless crew has become one of the enduring symbols of the plague's arrival. And we should note that such stories, repeated across many regions, may sometimes blur the line between literal fact and the way people made sense of a horror that seemed to come from nowhere. But whether each detail is precisely accurate or somewhat shaped in the retelling, the essential truth holds. The plague reached even these distant northern shores, carried by ships across cold seas, and it killed there as it killed everywhere. The disease pushed further still, into the lands of Eastern Europe and Russia, completing over the course of several years a conquest of nearly the entire continent. There were a few areas that seemed to have been less severely affected, certain isolated regions that the plague reached late or weakly, and historians have long been interested in these apparent exceptions and what they might reveal about how the disease spread and why. But these were exceptions to an overwhelming rule. Across Europe as a whole, From the Mediterranean to the Arctic, from the Atlantic coast to the Russian steppes, the Black Death left its mark, and that mark was death on a scale the continent had never known. What is most striking, looking at the whole sweep of the spread, is the speed of it. In the space of roughly 4 years, from 1347 to 1351, the disease traveled across the entire continent. By the standards of the medieval world, where most people never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace, and where news moved at the pace of a walking traveler or a sailing ship, this was a catastrophe that unfolded with terrifying rapidity. A region might have months of warning, hearing of the disease's approach from the south or the east, watching it draw nearer with each passing report. Or it might have almost no warning at all, the plague arriving on a ship or with a traveler before anyone understood what was coming. Either way, once it arrived, the dying began quickly, and within a matter of months, a region could lose a third or more of its people. And then, in any given place, the worst of it would pass. The plague was not a permanent state, but a wave that crashed over a region and then receded, leaving devastation in its wake. After the initial fury, which in most places lasted somewhere between a few months and a year or two, the death toll would subside. The disease did not vanish entirely. It would return in later years, as we will see. But the great initial mortality, the catastrophic first wave, would end, and the survivors would emerge, blinking, into a world utterly transformed. They had lived through the unthinkable. Now they had to discover what kind of world was left. When the great mortality finally passed from a region, when the dying slowed and then stopped and the survivors crept out of their houses to take stock of what remained, they found themselves in a world that had been hollowed out. The plague had not merely killed individuals. It had emptied villages, silenced workshops, abandoned fields, and left whole communities reduced to a fraction of what they had been. To live through the Black Death was to survive into a kind of ghost world, a landscape haunted by absence. Consider the simple, staggering arithmetic of it. If a third to a half of the population had died, and in some places even more, then the survivors lived among an overwhelming weight of loss. Almost no one was untouched. Nearly everyone had buried family members, often many of them. Children had lost parents. Parents had lost children. Husbands and wives had lost one another. Whole extended families had been wiped out entirely, their houses left empty, their names extinguished. The social fabric, the dense web of relationships that made up a person's world, had been torn apart on every side. To walk through a village after the plague was to pass empty houses where neighbors had lived, to see fields lying untended where families had farmed for generations, to feel the silence where there had once been the ordinary noise of human life. Some communities did not survive at all. Across Europe, there were villages that were so devastated by the plague that they were simply abandoned, never to be re-inhabited. In England in particular, historians and archaeologists have identified many of these lost villages or deserted medieval villages, settlements that vanished from the map in the wake of the plague and its aftermath. Sometimes the surviving population was too small to sustain the community, and the remnant moved away to join larger settlements or to take up better land elsewhere. Sometimes a village limped on for a time before finally being abandoned in the difficult decades that followed. The causes of village desertion are complex, and not every lost village can be attributed solely to the plague. Economic changes and shifts in land use also played their part over the following century. But the Great Mortality dealt a blow from which many small communities never recovered. Today, in the English countryside and elsewhere, the faint earthworks of these vanished villages can still be traced beneath the grass. The outlines of houses and lanes and gardens, the ghostly imprint of a community that the plague helped to erase. To stand in such a place is to stand in the literal footprint of the catastrophe, in a silence that has lasted nearly 7 centuries. The abandonment of fields was one of the most immediate and visible consequences. Medieval agriculture was enormously labor-intensive. It took many hands to plow, to sow, to weed, to harvest, to maintain the complex systems of farming that fed the population. When so many of those hands were gone, the the work could not be done. Fields that had been cultivated for centuries went to weeds and scrub. Crops rotted unharvested because there was no one to bring them in. Animals wandered untended. The careful, hard-won order that human labor had imposed on the land began, in places, to slip back toward wilderness. The survivors, even with fewer mouths to feed, faced the immediate problem of a food supply thrown into chaos by the collapse of the workforce that produced it. And yet, and this is one of the strange and important paradoxes of the aftermath, the survivors were not, in every respect, worse off. In some ways, they found themselves in a position that, in purely material terms, was actually improved. This requires some careful thought, because it cuts against the instinctive assumption that a catastrophe leaves only ruin. The plague killed people, but it did not destroy property, land, livestock, tools, houses, or accumulated wealth. All of that remained. What had changed was the ratio between people and things. Before the plague, Europe had been, as we discussed, overpopulated relative to its resources, with too many people competing for too little land and food, wages low and rents high because labor was abundant and land was scarce. After the plague, the equation was reversed. Suddenly there was far more land than there were people to work it, far more food relative to the number of mouths, far more of everything to go around among the survivors. A peasant family that survived might find itself able to take over the holdings of those who had died, to farm better land, to live, in material terms, better than before. This is one of the deep and unsettling ironies of the Black Death. For the individual human beings who lived through it, it was an unmitigated horror. The loss of loved ones, the trauma of survival, the shattering of every familiar structure. But for the survivors as an economic class, particularly the laboring poor, the catastrophe created conditions that would, over time, work to their advantage in ways that would have been unimaginable before. The world had been turned upside down, and out of the chaos, new possibilities emerged. Possibilities that would reshape European society in profound and lasting ways. We will turn to that transformation shortly, because it is one of the most important legacies of the entire catastrophe. But before we do, we should sit with the human reality of the empty world a moment longer, because the economic analysis, however true, can obscure the raw experience of those who endured it. Imagine being a survivor. Imagine having watched your world die. Imagine the strange, hollow quality of the days afterward. The empty houses, the unfamiliar quiet, the absence of so many faces you had known your whole life. Imagine the psychological weight of it, the grief that had no time or space to be properly mourned because the dying had come too fast and too overwhelming, the guilt of having lived when so many died, the lingering terror that the plague might return. Some survivors, the records suggest, fell into a kind of despair or numbness. Others threw themselves into life with a new intensity, marrying quickly, seizing opportunities, grasping at whatever the transformed world now offered. The trauma of the great mortality did not end when the dying stopped. It lived on in the minds and hearts of those who remained, a wound carried by an entire generation. There were also profound disruptions to the ordinary transmission of life and knowledge between generations. So many had died that skills, crafts, and traditions were sometimes lost or passed on incompletely, because the experienced masters had perished before they could fully teach the young. Families were reconstituted in strange new shapes by the deaths and the remarriages that followed. Inheritances passed in unexpected directions as the normal lines of succession were broken by mass death. Children were orphaned in great numbers. The whole machinery of social continuity, the way a society reproduces itself and hands down its ways from one generation to the next, had been violently disrupted. Europe would rebuild, would repopulate over the following century and more, but it would not simply return to what it had been. Too much had been broken. Too much had changed. And so the survivors faced their hollowed world, richer in land and goods, poorer in every human connection, traumatized, grieving, but alive. They had endured the unendurable. Now they would begin, slowly, to remake the world the plague had left them. And in that remaking, the old order of medieval society, the rigid hierarchy of lord and peasant that had governed life for centuries, would face challenges it had never known before. The Black Death had killed tens of millions, but it had also, without intending to, handed the survivors a strange and unexpected power, and they would not be slow to use it. The medieval social order rested on a bargain so old and so deeply assumed that most people probably never thought of it as a bargain at all. It was simply the way the world worked. At the bottom were the peasants, the vast majority of the population who worked the land. Above them were the lords, who owned the land and to whom the peasants owed labor, rents, and a host of obligations. Many peasants were not free in the way we understand the word. They were bound to the land they worked, unable to leave without permission, tied by law and custom to their lord's estate. This was the system we call feudalism, or more precisely the manorial system, and it had ordered European society for centuries. It rested, fundamentally, on the fact that labor was abundant and land was scarce. There were always more peasants than there was good land to work, and so the lords held the power. A peasant who was unhappy had nowhere else to go and no leverage to demand better. The lords set the terms. The Black Death shattered this arrangement, and it did so through the brutal logic of supply and demand. When a third to a half of the population died, the supply of labor collapsed. Suddenly, there were not enough workers to go around. The fields that needed plowing, the crops that needed harvesting, the work that needed doing. There were no longer enough hands to do it all. And this transformed, overnight, the bargaining position of those who survived. For the first time in living memory, perhaps for the first time in centuries, labor was scarce and therefore valuable. The peasant who had once been powerless now found that his labor was in desperate demand, that lords were competing for workers, that he could, suddenly, ask for more. And ask for more they did. Across Europe, in the years after the Great Mortality, laborers and peasants began to demand higher wages, better terms, greater freedom. A worker could now go to a lord and say, in effect, that if he was not paid more, he would simply go elsewhere to another lord who would pay better. And there was always another lord, desperate for hands, willing to do so. Wages rose, in some cases dramatically. The bound peasant found new possibilities for freedom, because a lord who treated his workers too harshly might find them gone, slipping away to find better conditions on another estate or in the towns where labor was equally in demand. The whole structure of obligation and deference that had held the peasantry in place began to loosen and crack. The world had, quite literally, been turned upside down. Those who had been at the bottom found themselves, for the first time, with real power. The lords and the ruling classes were horrified. This was not how the world was supposed to work. The natural order, as they understood it, placed peasants firmly beneath their masters, and the sudden assertiveness of the laboring classes seemed to threaten the very foundations of society. And so they fought back, not with armies but with laws. Across Europe, ruling authorities attempted to legislate the old order back into place, to freeze wages at their pre-plague levels, to bind peasants to their land and their lords, to criminalize the new mobility and the new demands. In England, the most famous of these efforts was a series of laws, beginning with an ordinance in 1349 and followed by the Statute of Labourers in 1351, which attempted to cap wages at the levels that had prevailed before the plague and to compel labourers to work for whoever demanded their service at those fixed rates. Similar measures were attempted in other lands. The intent was clear. The ruling classes wanted to undo the economic effects of the plague, to deny the survivors the leverage that mass death had handed them, and to restore the comfortable old hierarchy in which the powerful held all the cards. But these laws, on the whole, failed. They could not repeal the basic reality that labor was now scarce and valuable. A law might declare that wages should remain at the old levels, but a lord who needed his harvest brought in, and who faced the loss of his crop if he could not find workers, would quietly pay more than the law allowed, because the alternative was ruin. The economic pressure was simply too strong. The laws were widely evaded and often unenforceable, and while they caused real friction and resentment, they could not hold back the fundamental shift in power. Over the following decades, despite all the efforts of the ruling classes, the position of the laboring poor in much of Europe improved. Serfdom, the system of bound peasant labor, went into a long decline in many Western European lands, gradually giving way to freer forms of labor and tenancy. The change was uneven, slow, and varied greatly from region to region. In some parts of Eastern Europe, serfdom would actually intensify in later centuries, in a divergence that historians have studied closely. But in much of the West, the long-term trend ran toward greater freedom and better conditions for those who worked the land, and the Black Death was a major force driving that change. The tension between the demands of the laboring classes and the determination of the rulers to suppress them did not always remain confined to the quiet evasion of laws. Sometimes it exploded into open revolt. The decades after the plague saw a series of uprisings across Europe, as peasants and laborers, newly aware of their own importance and bitterly resentful of the attempts to hold them down, rose against their masters. The most famous of these in England was the Great Revolt of 1381, often called the Peasants' Revolt, when a massive uprising swept through the country, driven by resentment over taxation, the labor laws, and the broader grievances of the common people. The rebels marched on London, seized the city for a time, and confronted the young king directly with their demands. The revolt was ultimately suppressed, often brutally, and its immediate aims were largely defeated. But the fact that it happened at all, that the common people of England could organize, rise up, and shake the kingdom to its foundations, was itself a sign of how profoundly the world had changed. Such an uprising would have been almost unthinkable before the plague. The catastrophe had not only altered the economics of labor, it had altered something in the minds of the laboring poor, a new sense that the old order was not eternal and unchangeable, that those at the bottom had power and that they could demand more. It would be too simple, and historians rightly caution against it, to draw a single straight line from the Black Death to the end of feudalism, or to credit the plague alone with the transformation of European society. Many forces were at work over the long centuries that followed, and the changes were complex, gradual, and varied enormously from place to place. The decline of serfdom, the rise of wage labor, the slow shifts in the balance of power between classes. All of these had multiple causes, and the picture is one that scholars continue to study and debate. But there is broad agreement that the Black Death was a powerful catalyst, that it dramatically accelerated changes that might otherwise have taken far longer, and that the world which emerged from the catastrophe was, in fundamental ways, different from the one that had entered it. The plague had killed on an almost unimaginable scale, and in doing so, it had cracked open the rigid order of medieval society and let through new possibilities. Possibilities of freedom, of mobility, of a different relationship between those who labored and those who ruled. There is something profound and profoundly strange in this. The greatest catastrophe in European history, a disaster of pure suffering and death, became also an engine of change that, over the long run, may have improved the lives of millions of ordinary people and helped to set Europe on a new path. This is not to say that the plague was in any sense good, or that its benefits outweighed its horrors. No economic shift could ever balance the scale against tens of millions of dead. But it is to recognize the deep irony of history, the way that even the most terrible events can reshape the world in unexpected directions, the way that out of catastrophe can come transformation. The survivors of the Black Death inherited a broken world. But in the breaking, the old chains had loosened, and the world they built from the ruins would not be the same as the one that had been lost. We tend to speak of the Black Death as a single event, a discrete catastrophe with a beginning and an end. The years from 1347 to 1351, when the great mortality swept across Europe and then receded. And in one sense, that is accurate. The first and most devastating wave did pass. The dying slowed. The survivors emerged into their transformed world and began the long work of rebuilding. But to imagine that the plague simply ended, that it came and went and was over, would be to badly misunderstand the true scope of what had happened. Because the Black Death was not a single event. It was the beginning of an age, and its shadow would stretch across the following centuries, falling again and again upon the generations to come. The disease did not vanish after that first terrible wave. It went quiet in many places for a time, but it returned. In 1361, only a little more than a decade after the first great mortality, the plague struck again across much of Europe. This second wave was, in some regions, particularly deadly to children, perhaps because the young had been born after the first wave and had never been exposed to the disease, while older survivors carried some measure of acquired resistance. Though the mechanisms of this are debated, and the science of how immunity to the plague worked in medieval populations is complex and not fully understood. This outbreak was sometimes called the children's plague for the toll it took on the young, and it was followed by another wave, and another, and another. For the rest of the 14th century, through the 15th and 16th centuries, and indeed for some 300 years and more, the plague returned to Europe again and again in waves great and small, striking particular cities or regions or sometimes whole swaths of the continent. This is one of the most important and least appreciated facts about the Black Death. It was not a one-time disaster that people endured and then put behind them. It became a permanent feature of life, a recurring terror that hung over every generation for centuries. A person born in the decades after the first wave would live their whole life knowing that the plague could return at any time, that it had returned before and would return again, that the swellings and the fever and the mass graves were not a memory, but an ever-present possibility. The disease became woven into the very fabric of European existence, a dark thread running through the centuries. Great cities developed systems to deal with its recurrence. The quarantine measures we mentioned earlier, the pest houses where the sick were isolated, the boards of health that tried to manage outbreaks, the records kept of plague deaths. An entire infrastructure of response grew up around a disease that simply would not go away. Some of the most famous later outbreaks, the Great Plague that struck London in the 1660s, for instance, more than 3 centuries after the first arrival, were themselves catastrophic events that killed tens of thousands. The plague that arrived on those Genoese galleys in 1347 was the opening of a long and terrible chapter, not its conclusion. The psychological imprint of all this was immense, and it shaped European culture in ways that endured long after any individual outbreak had passed. When death on such a scale becomes a recurring feature of life, when no one can feel truly safe, when the catastrophe lives always just over the horizon, it changes how people think, how they create, how they understand their own existence. And we can see this transformation reflected vividly in the art and culture of the age. We mentioned earlier the image of the danse macabre, the dance of death, in which skeletons lead away people of every rank and station. This image, and others like it, became wildly popular in the centuries after the Black Death, appearing in paintings, woodcuts, sculptures, and manuscripts across Europe. The theme was always the same, that death comes for everyone, regardless of wealth, power, beauty, or piety. The king and the beggar, the bishop and the laborer, the young bride and the old miser, all are seized by death and led away in the same grim dance. There is something almost democratic in this vision, a bleak equality before the grave, and it spoke directly to a population that had watched the plague cut down high and low alike with perfect indifference. The art of the period became saturated with reminders of mortality. Skulls, skeletons, decaying corpses, the brevity of life, the certainty of death. This was the age that gave rise to the memento mori, the reminder of death, and to a whole tradition of art and devotion centered on contemplating one's own mortality. The plague had taught Europe a lesson it could not forget, that death was always near, always waiting, and could come for anyone at any time. This preoccupation with death was not merely morbid. It was, in its way, a profound response to a profound trauma. A civilization that had endured the unendurable was trying to make sense of it, to give meaning to suffering that seemed meaningless, to find some way to live in the shadow of constant death. Some turned to deeper piety, to an intensified focus on the afterlife and the salvation of the soul. Some turned to a kind of fatalism, an acceptance that life was fragile and fleeting and beyond control. And some, as we noted, turned to seizing what pleasure and meaning they could in the time they had. The plague forced an entire culture to confront, again and again, the most fundamental questions of human existence: why we suffer, why we die, what it all means. And the answers it reached, in art and religion and philosophy, bore the marks of that confrontation for centuries. The broader consequences of the Black Death ripple outward in so many directions that historians are still tracing them, still debating their extent and their meaning. We have spoken of the economic and social transformations, the loosening of the old feudal order, the new power of the laboring classes. There were religious consequences too, the long-term effects of the crisis of faith we discussed, the shaken authority of a church that had proven helpless against the disease, changes whose full implications would unfold over the following centuries. There were demographic consequences, as Europe's population, so drastically reduced, took well over a century in many places to recover to its pre-plague levels. And the long period of lower population had its own effects on everything from the price of land to the patterns of settlement to the structure of families. Some historians have even argued, though this is debated and complex, that the upheavals of the plague era, the labor shortages and the social changes and the questioning of old certainties helped to create conditions that contributed to the great transformations that would follow in European history. Though we should be very cautious about drawing such grand and direct connections across the centuries, since history is never so simple and so many other forces were always at work. What we can say with confidence is that the Black Death was one of the great hinges of history, a moment when the world turned. It killed on a scale that has rarely been matched in all of human experience. It traumatized a civilization. It reshaped economies, societies, religions, and minds. And it left a shadow that stretched across centuries, a recurring terror that shaped the European experience for generations, a memory burned so deep that it has never entirely faded. Even today, nearly 700 years later, the Black Death remains a kind of touchstone, the catastrophe against which other catastrophes are measured, the great dying that haunts our collective imagination. When we speak of plague, of pandemic, of disease sweeping across the world, the Black Death is there in the background, the archetype of the great mortality, the disaster that showed humanity just how fragile its world could be. And here, perhaps, is where the story reaches across the centuries to touch us directly. Because the Black Death is not only a tale of a distant medieval past, of a world utterly unlike our own. It is also a story about things that remain deeply human and deeply present. It is a story about how people respond to catastrophe, to fear, to suffering that cannot be understood or controlled. It is a story about the search for explanation, the reaching for meaning, the temptation to find someone to blame. It is a story about the breakdown of social bonds under unbearable stress, and also about the persistence of courage and compassion even in the darkest moments. The physicians who stayed at their posts, the priests who died tending the sick, the voices that spoke against the persecution of the innocent. It is a story about how a society can be broken and yet survive, how out of even the greatest catastrophe, life and change and renewal can come. These are not medieval themes. They are human themes, as relevant now as they were then. When we stand back and look at the whole sweep of it, the ships arriving at Messina, the dying in the towns, the helpless physicians, the shaken faith, the bloody processions of the flagellants, the terrible search for scapegoats, the relentless spread across the continent, the emptied villages, the world turned upside down, the long shadow stretching across the centuries. we are looking at one of the defining experiences of the human past. The people who lived through it were not so different from us. They loved and feared and hoped as we do. They wanted to understand their world and to protect those they loved as we do. And they faced a catastrophe that tested them beyond anything we can easily imagine. And somehow, those who survived endured it and rebuilt and carried on. The casa, the village, the city, the continent, life returned to them all in time. The fields were ploughed again. The children were born again. The bells rang again. And the world that emerged, scarred and changed and forever marked by what it had endured, went on. That is, in the end, perhaps the most important thing the Black Death has to teach us. Not only how terrible suffering can be, though it teaches that with unforgettable force, but also how resilient the human spirit can be in the face of it. The survivors of the Great Mortality had every reason to despair. They had watched their world die, and yet they did not give up. They buried their dead however they could. They tended the sick, even at the cost of their own lives. They demanded a better world from the ruins of the old one. They made art and asked questions and searched for meaning. They lived, and because they lived, we are here. So tonight, as you settle into your warm bed, in a world with medicine and sanitation and an understanding of the invisible enemies that the medieval world could only fear, perhaps spare a quiet thought for those who lived through the night the Black Death arrived in Europe, for the sailors on the death ships and the people of the dying towns, for the physicians who fought a war they could not win, and the priests who died at the bedsides of the doomed, for the millions who perished, each one a world ending, and for the survivors who carried on through grief we can scarcely imagine. They endured the unendurable in a darkness deeper than we will hopefully ever know, and in enduring, they passed something down to us. Not only the long shadow of the catastrophe, but the quiet, stubborn proof that even the worst the world can do is not always the end of the story. The ships have long since rotted away. The plague pits lie silent beneath the cities and the fields. The names of nearly all who died are lost forever, swallowed by the centuries. But the story remains. And as long as we remember it, as long as we sit together in the quiet and turn it over in our minds, those distant lives are not entirely gone. As always, thank you for spending this time here in the dark with me. If this journey into one of history's darkest chapters moved you, consider leaving a like and subscribing if you haven't already, so we can continue exploring these strange and haunting corners of the past together. And let me know in the comments, what part of this story stayed with you the most? Until next time, stay curious and sleep well, knowing the worst nights in history are behind us, not ahead.